What is up, everyone? Welcome back to the Cloudology channel again. So, today, for you, I'm going to explain what Ansible is to you. And unfortunately, I spent the last 2 hours preparing for this stream to try to get Ansible running correctly locally, but M1 Mac strikes again. So, I'm going to create a separate video that shows you how to kind of set up Ansible in a remote host and actually execute commands with it. But before we begin, shout out to Christian Soto, my number one fan out there, who is usually commenting in my comment section, which is awesome. So, what is Ansible? I'm sure if you are studying cloud at all in any propensity, you have heard of Ansible because Ansible and Terraform kind of go hand in hand in most situations that I see. Most companies, actually all the companies I've worked at actually use Ansible. They use it in a different format. They don't use it like vanilla Ansible. I don't know anyone that kind of uses Ansible like that. Typically it's used with Ansible Tower, which is basically just an enterprise level version of Ansible, and it gives you a graphical user interface because without that, Ansible can get kind of confusing. But what is Ansible? What does it even do? What does it mean? Well, I don't know what the name means, to be fair, but I do know what it does. It's what is called configuration management. It's a configuration management tool. And now, what does configuration management mean? Essentially, that is just a huge buzzword that is meant for how you want your environment or your virtual machines in your environment to be configured. So that's exactly what Ansible does. So let's say you have 100 VMs, 100 virtual machines in a cloud platform somewhere. Well, imagine you had to do an update to every single one of those VMs. But maybe those updates are different depending on the VM type, or what if you have like 75 Windows VMs, God help you, and then another 25 Linux VMs. Well, that would be pretty annoying. Or even, a multitude of other Linux distributions that might use different commands to make updates, right? Well, it'd be pretty annoying to actually go into 100 different virtual machines and update them or make changes to them one at a time. It would probably take you a week to do that realistically in an environment if you're doing it that way, which, I'm no one to judge. Who am I to judge? If you want to take a week to update your VMs, fine by me. I don't care. But ideally, that's not the best situation. So Ansible simplifies that, and it allows you to write down in code, or more specifically YAML, and I'll show you an example of that in a bit. Define what actions you want to be taken on those virtual machines that you have a list of, right? So essentially, Ansible runs on its own virtual machine, right? So there's this one virtual machine, ideally 2 or 3 if you want high availability or like failover or something like that. But for this demonstration purposes, you have one Ansible virtual machine that runs all of your Ansible playbooks. All of your playbooks are stored on that machine, maybe. Again, bad practice, but like short example, right? So essentially what that can do is it can read that playbook and say, okay, this guy wants to do these steps to this list of VMs. And I'll actually show you my very detailed whiteboard here. I'm sure it's very plain and boring, but it gets the point across. So as you can see here, this right here is your virtual machine that runs Ansible, right? And it has this list. Well, it has this list of all of these virtual machines, right? And how does it list them? Well, you can list them by host name. You can list them by IP address. You can list them by private IP address if they're within the same network, or Ansible has communication specifically to those VMs and that network. So it has a list of all of the machines that you want Ansible to manage, right? And what it does is it goes down through that list and it'll apply those changes in code to all of those VMs in order. So, for example, this is an Ansible playbook, and I got this from Ansible's documentation. Nothing crazy here. If you look at YAML specifically, YAML is supposed to be very easy to read. I think it's easy to read, but obviously it's because I work in cloud, so I know how to. Our whole job is basically in YAML. So I can kind of break down this YAML file to explain what everything really means. So you're giving this first step a name. So obviously you want to update your web servers, and maybe you have a host, a list of hosts, an inventory of hosts called web servers, which is just going to be in a file that looks something like this, right? Oh no, my IPs. So basically we can just let's do cat etcd or etsy Ansible hosts. Okay, so I know this is a very small inventory list, but here you can see the format of the inventory file. So in brackets here you have this name, this web server's name, right? And underneath that web server's name, you're going to have each IP that you want to target, right? So every single IP in your environment or in your network or in a different group of VMs, so you can group your VMs by, inventory basically. You're going to have a list of all three of these VMs in that file, right? So it's going to look something like this. If there were three, it would look. So if we did a VI, we're going to do a sudo vi etcd Ansible host. I keep saying etcd. It's not etcd. My password. Oh, I messed that up. That's not my password. I don't know what that is. Okay. So let's say I wanted to add different IPs in here, right? So I can add, if I owned google.com, I could put google.com in here. It's not going to run against it because, I would hope google.com, that domain, doesn't have open port 22, an SSH port. I can put another IP address. I can put my local host if I wanted to. It's not going to do anything, but I can put it there. So let's imagine these were the DNS names or IP addresses of these three servers, right? So let's go back to our playbook. So here we're just setting, we're setting a remote user. So obviously we need to be root in a Linux VMs, and root is essentially just the admin user of the Linux virtual machine. And then we're going to define some tasks that you wanted to do. So these are the things you want to apply to this list of virtual machines. So you can see here, we're giving it a name that says ensure Apache is at the latest version. So obviously what we're going to do is we're going to make sure the web server Apache is of a certain version. So we're going to make sure it's updated to a certain version. So here, Ansible built-in yum. So basically here we're just using the yum command in order to update the service called HTTPD, which is the service name for Apache. So when it's running on a virtual machine and you're trying to find what this service is called, it's called HTTPD, which just means Apache. It's Apache web server. And you're setting the state of that server. So by state, we mean the state that it's currently in. This is what we want it to be. We want it to be at the latest version, right? And here we're going to write the Apache config file. So again, we're going to use an Ansible built-in. I forget what these are called. These are called. I think they're plugins. I think they're Ansible plugins. I don't quote me on that. I could be wrong. So another plugin that's going to template the HTTPD config. So the Apache configuration. Basically, it's going to set the configuration in the state that you want it to be. And then we're going to say, hey, we're going to update the database servers. So this is a new task now, and you can tell based off of the indentation, right? So you can see how this indentation is a little bit farther to the right than this indentation. So this is selecting a different inventory list. So this is reaching out to a completely different set of virtual machines as the root user, and it's going to carry out a different set of tasks. So in this case, we're going to ensure Postgres is at the latest version. Again, same thing we did with Apache. We're going to set the state to the latest, and we're going to give it the service name. So we're going to use the plugin Yum, which is just a package manager for Red Hat, actually. Or I think it's, Red Hat. So Red Hat distribution of Linux. We're not going to get into that too much, but it's just a package manager. It's like NPM or Yarn for you developers, or pip for you Python users. So essentially, it's just going to make sure this service is at the latest version. So it's going to fetch version data, compare it to your version, and if it's not the latest version, it's going to update it automatically, right? And then it's also going to make sure it's started after you update it, because a lot of times after you update a service on any virtual machine, it's going to restart, right? Because it has to restart. It's kind of like updating your computer. When you update your computer, you have to restart for it to, take effect, right? So Ansible is going to make sure that that service is restarted again. And that's pretty much it as far as like Ansible Playbook goes. So again, I had this really awesome demonstration planned. However, that is going to have to be a different video, and I'm going to make it a little bit more applicable to and a little bit more visual for you guys to see how Ansible is actually changing things inside of a VM. But for the time being, basic premise, just remember it runs on a host, and this can be your own machine. So this can be locally, as long as your machine, your computer has access to all your virtual machines, right? Through, firewall rules or, G Cloud, maybe if you're using Google. It looks at a list of virtual machines, which it can then reach out to and apply updates in the form of playbooks that look like this. They're called Ansible Playbooks. Now, there's a multitude of ways to do this, right? So you can group playbooks together in what are called roles, and you can execute a certain number of playbooks. It can really get in the weeds, honestly. I don't really want to get that far into it this video because I don't have a good example to show y'all. So once we get that up and running, I'm going to plan for next week. I'm going to work on it through the weekend, and I'm going to have a good setup for you guys to actually understand and visualize as much as possible and it actually happen in real time. So in the meantime, I'm going to call this good. You have a basic understanding of what Ansible is, and next week I'm going to be back with a demo, and we're actually going to provision some VMs. We're going to provision our Ansible VM, right? And that's going to run all of our Ansible code. Our playbooks are going to be on there. I'm going to write custom playbooks just so you guys can see how it's done. I'm going to use, obviously, YAML syntax because YAML is how you write playbooks. And I'm going to have it make actual visual changes to the virtual machines in there. So what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to group, I'm going to spin up like 5 or 6 VMs. I'm going to group 3 and 3. I'm going to make different changes to different sets of VMs using different inventories. I know sounds like a bunch of buzzwords because it kind of is, but this is how things are done in the cloud. These are how we make updates to hundreds or thousands of VMs without actually doing it. And the cool thing about Ansible is you can run them on schedules. If you're on, Ansible Tower, you can run them at specific times. You could run them in specific events. So if something happens, it's going to execute this playbook. It's a really awesome tool. I really like Ansible. It is very slow, however. So if you're updating 1,000 VMs with Ansible, it's going to take you a while. I hope you have a couple Ansible hosts that reach out to different groups. Another note that I wanted to notice, or that I wanted to say, is that I almost forgot. The way Ansible connects to a virtual machine is it has to connect through, if it's a Linux box, it has to connect through secure shell, so SSH, which means port 22 on that virtual machine has to be open in order for Ansible to communicate to it. And for Windows servers, it has to have port, I think it's 3389 for RDP, which just means remote desktop access, basically. So that's how you access Windows virtual machines in the cloud. If you ever have to do that, I still have to do that. Like they're Windows machines that I have running in various environments. But with that being said, that is a brief overview of Ansible, what it's responsible for, what it does. Next week, I'll be back with a more technical deep dive into Ansible so I can show you guys how to use it and potentially how to use it in your cloud environment. So, with that being said, you guys have a great week. I will see you next week. Goodbye.